I would not have appreciated the power or importance of the KIPP when I ran into it for the first time in 2001 in DC if I had not had the experience of my life 2 decades before in Los Angeles, running into a teacher who changed my life, Jaime Escalante. I had seen something in the LA Times. I was the Washington Post reporter in Los Angeles, and I'd seen an item in the LA Times that said that 12 kids at a high school in East Los Angeles, poor kids, had cheated on the advanced placement calculus exam, and I went to see the teacher of that class. His name was Jaime Escalante. He became a legend, but this is 6 years before they made a movie about him. And he was doing things that I found were phenomenal. And essentially, he was taking these inner city kids and believing that they could learn more, giving them more time to learn and more encouragement to learn. That sort of sums it up. And in 1987, I saw him produce 25% of all the Mexican-American kids in the country who passed an advanced placement calculus exam. That's a great testament to him and the other teacher that worked with him, but it really meant that we had hundreds of schools out there, maybe thousands, with that kind of kid in their classes who weren't doing that. And why was that? And it was clear to me once I got to look at it and wrote a book about him that nobody else believed, very few believed, that these kids could work at that level. But he did, and he proved that if you gave them more time and encouragement, they could do amazing things. So 20 years later, I'm now in DC. I'm finally getting to be a full-time education reporter. I'd written a couple books freelance when I was doing other things for the Post. And so I walk into a church basement in Southeast Washington, and there's this young woman who I had met before. She was a DC teacher, Susan Schaeffler, and she was with her dad putting together the furniture. And her dad says, and she says, well, we're preparing for our 5th grade. We're going to call them the class of 2009. And I was trying to do the math, and the dad said, well, that means that's the year they're graduating from high school, right? And Susan says, no, Dad, that's the year they're all going to college. And she was talking about 5th graders, 10-year-olds, who 8 years later she was insisting would all be ready for college, which was, the poorest part of town. And that struck me as something that Jaime Escalante would say. And the minute I saw that and then began to watch what she was doing, it was clear to me that they were doing the same things. Jaime Escalante emphasized high expectations for every kid. And indeed, that's what KIPP did. They had that, everybody's going to college. Jaime emphasized more time for kids, and at KIPP, and he did it just by keeping kids after school or bringing them in on Saturdays. KIPP, you had a much longer school day. Jaime emphasized having a good exam that they were preparing for, taking exams seriously, not poo-pooing that you shouldn't prepare for the test. You should have a good test to prepare for. And that's what KIPP was doing. They were looking at their results and taking them seriously. And lastly, they were creating a community atmosphere, a spirit of team and family. The kids were together with the teachers to beat the test, to beat these difficulties, these challenges that they were facing together. And that's what Jaime was all about, everybody getting together to beat the AP exam. So once I saw that, I said, well, this is something I really want to write about. And so I contacted the 2 guys, Mike Levin and Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin, Mike and Dave. And they were, they sort of wrote the book. These are, wonderfully verbal, funny, aggressive personalities. You could stick a tape recorder in front of them and just ask questions, and they would tell stories forever, and often in exciting circumstances. I did a lot of interviews with Mike Feinberg when he was taking me from Houston to Austin because he had a group of people who were lobbying the state legislature about something. And I said, well, Mike, why don't you drive and I will just work the tape recorder. And he was going 85 to 90 miles an hour down this highway, scaring the bejesus out of me. I called his friend Dave Levin, who was in New York at this point, said, you didn't tell me that he drove like this. And he said, oh, yeah, he thought this was very funny, that I was frightened. But, the stories kept coming out. Same thing with Dave. He couldn't drive fast in New York, but he was in his car all the time, stopping at McDonald's, stopping at sandwich shops, At the same time, he was taking notes and working at PDA. So it was very dangerous to be driving around with either of these guys. But once I got into the research for the book, what was really interesting was how annoyed people were about these two guys. You could tell their stories, which were wonderful, but you couldn't get the power of what they were doing until you talked to people who would work with them, particularly early on. I had learned, writing about Jaime Escalante, that many people at his high school hated him, that he had pushed so hard and been so tough about keeping his standards up that he had alienated at least half of the faculty. And that struck me as interesting because when I started to talk about the early people who worked with Mike and Dave, I got the same experience. In each case, both in Mike's case and Dave's case, they developed a relationship with a woman, an older woman in each of their districts, whom I called their godmothers or their den mothers. Essentially, Ann Patterson in Houston, who was a deputy superintendent in Houston, who discovered Mike running this little charter program. And in New York, a woman named Susan Winston, who was also a middle-level administrator who had, discovered this school that Dave was doing in South Bronx. And in each case, they were intrigued by these guys. They were full of energy, pushing kids to the way. But once they decided, well, I'm going to help this guy, they ruled the day. There was one point in Houston when Ann Patterson was trying to help Mike Feinberg find a larger building because his school was growing. It had gone from just a 5th grade to a 5th and 6th grade. He wanted to go to 7th grade. He couldn't find a building, a school that would share space with him, in part because everybody had heard what a hard-nosed guy he was and how hard to deal with. So at one point, when the deadline was about a week to go, he had to have a new building. He introduced what he called the study in democratic methods. He had all of his 5th and 6th graders write letters. No, wasn't letters. Sent them home, had a day off because there was a teacher training that day. Okay, here's the script you're going to read. Here are the numbers of all the school board members, all the leading leaders of the school district. Call them up and you should say, and we'll practice. Hi, my name is Manuel Montoya. I'm at the KIPP school, and we're not going to have a classroom next year unless somebody does something about this. We're the hardest working kids in Houston and really need this. These kids started calling all over the Houston Independent School District. Eventually, somebody figured out that this was that guy that Ann Patterson was dealing with, and she got this enormous amount of hell dropped on her for what they had done to their day. But, eventually Mike didn't get the classroom until he essentially planted himself in the parking lot of the school superintendent, and when the superintendent came out at the end of the day, forced him to sort of deal with the question. He got his space. But that produced this great wave of ill will, and it occurred to me as I was looking at great charters like this one, that's what you have, the price you have to be able to pay. You have to be able to absorb all that negative energy you're going to get when you're pushing for higher standards. And it occurs to me that all of the nonsense we hear about charters and all the negativity that people throw out charters is in part a result of that. When you have people, educators, pushing for higher standards, it produces a lot of people saying, who do they think they are? Why are they pushing me this hard? They're making me feel bad today. In Dave's case, Susan told him that he was going to have to move to another school, and they had space for him. But just at that point, the new district superintendent said, no, I think you should stay there. We don't have space for you. So over a weekend, he moved himself. He had all his kids come out. He took all his equipment from one school, moved them to the other school without seeking any permission. Once he was there, he figured they wouldn't do anything to him. And again, it caused great troubles bureaucratically for Susan. But she went ahead and realized, I think, I talked to them years later, and they were sort of reconciled to these bad boys. But that's the way you have to do it if you're going to really make change in schools.